Are there any Democrats talking about solutions on some of these things? I mean, there used to be some good Democrats years ago, and they can't be entirely monolithic.
Well, that's a great question, and even as recently as the 115th Congress, I mean, 2017, 2018, there were a number of really thoughtful Democrat colleagues who were working with us trying to forge a bipartisan consensus. We don't hear any talk of this now, and I think there may be a number of reasons for that, and I think that they've effectively been ordered not to. I mean, none of them are allowed to step out of line because they do party discipline really well on the other side.
I see.
To be very frank about it, the rise of these kind of big government socialist progressives is a real threat to the whole country, but certainly even within the Democrat Party. You see the tug of war they're having on the reconciliation bill and all that, because the small handful of just liberals are now being overrun by the true socialists. And the socialist part of their agenda is open borders, and they openly, profess to believe in this now. And so they will not allow the more moderate members or the less liberal members, you pick how you describe them, they will not allow them to address this or even talk about it. So it's basically become silent on the other side, and that's part of the great concern.
Do you think that, as sort of my follow-up from the question, if they lose the majority, and there are any of these less liberal members still left in Congress, and there'll be a few at least, do you foresee maybe some of them then being, having experienced the discipline of voters, maybe being more willing to talk with you guys and work on something?
I certainly think that's true. I mean, you think of, for example, Congressman Cuellar, the people who live close to the border, that this directly affects their community. As we like to say all the time now, every state's a border state because this problem affects everyone. But the people who see it most acutely realize that something must be done, and they have been pretty vocal in their urgency. So I do think, I have hope that after the next election cycle, when the new reality sets in, when we have a massive majority Republican control in the House, and I think the Senate flips to a small margin of Republican control as well, I think that we'll have some very thoughtful conversations. We will certainly be open to it, and my hope is that we can forge consensus and get this done.
Good. Do we have a question? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I want to ask a question sort of at 50,000 feet. You've mentioned this, the congressman in particular. Why do we have limits on immigration? Why not let everyone in? And is there a reason to limit people? What are those reasons, if any of you think? It appears that there's a large fraction of the Democratic Party that feels that maybe we should have nearly or something like unlimited immigration, and weak asylum rules are one way. But could you just give us some idea of why maybe as a country would want to limit immigration?
I'll take that one first. There are actually two, and it's a good question. There are two reasons in the law why we have limits on immigration. The first one can be found in Section 212.85 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, and that is to protect the wages and working conditions of Americans. Again, most of the people who are making these decisions, most of the people who are working in Congress, with due respect to the congressman, aren't actually competing in the workforce against most of the people who are entering illegally. Most of the people who enter illegally have very low levels of education, very few job skills. Again, I come from a blue-collar family. My father was a steel worker at the age of 17. I understand the sort of struggles that individuals go through. We do have large pockets of the United States where the education system is not very good, where employment opportunities are not, available. And for that reason, they have to take the jobs that they can get. And again, that entry-level job, the first job is the one that helps you to get the second, the third, and the 29th one that you're going to get. If you don't get that first job, you don't get that ultimate job. When you bring in a large population of individuals who are competing directly with the most disadvantaged members of society, those disadvantaged members of society are going to lose. It is going to adversely affect them, and it's going to trap them in a cycle of poverty. Barbara Jordan, civil rights icon, former Democratic congressman from Houston, Texas, chairman of President Clinton's Commission on Immigration Reform, put it best when she said immigration policy should be directed toward protecting the most vulnerable members of society, and she identified them. Inner city youth, members of minority groups, and migrants who have not adjusted to life in the United States thus far. We need to protect the most disadvantaged members of society. Immigration is how we do that. And, that really is the thing. The other thing is, we are a nation. Even President Obama a few weeks back made this point. We're a nation state, and nation states have borders. We make our laws and we enforce our laws. The third reason, however, is one of national security. We know that individuals have come to the United States. The Center put out an excellent piece back in the early 2000s, The Open Door, that described how a number of foreign nationals had come to the United States and carried out terrorist attacks. The most notable example, of course, is September the 11th, when all 19 hijackers gamed the American immigration system to come here and to kill 3,000 Americans. So, those are all the reasons. It's a law enforcement issue because, again, as the congressman mentioned, we don't want MS-13 members to be here. We don't want to have drunk drivers on the streets. Drunk driving in particular is a crime that is susceptible to repetition. Mothers Against Drunk Drivers says the average person drives drunk 90 times before they're caught once. Under the Mike Johnson Amendment, that would mean that somebody could drive drunk 900 times and still be allowed to get a green card and eventually citizenship in the United States. We have our own criminal problem in the United States. Respectfully, we need to enforce our laws so we don't make that criminal problem any worse.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Congressman? Or?
I got a lot of thoughts,
Yeah.
but as usual,
Yeah.
I cannot improve on what Art said. I will say there's a phrase that he just mentioned that I think is really important. He said, when you allow this, you do not allow for adjustment to life inside the United States. That assimilation principle is really important. Part of the importance of having a sound immigration law that's followed and sound immigration policy is you allow us to maintain our identity as a nation state. What does it mean to be an American? Our system, our legal system allows for people to come here and assimilate to who we are, not to flood this nation and make it into nothing or all things, because then we're no longer the United States of America. There, as I mentioned it in my opening, there is a reason that we are the most powerful, most successful, most benevolent nation in the history of the world. It's because we're based on these certain foundational principles. We have the free market capitalist system. We have individual freedom and limited government, and this principle of the rule of law, and peace through strength, and fiscal responsibility, free markets, human dignity. These are things that are inherently part of our system, and if you flood it with every other idea, philosophy, and everything in the world, then you lose that identity, and that identity is important, not only to us, not only to American citizens, but to everybody around the world, because we have proven over the last 200 years, particularly over the last century or so, that a strong America is good for the entire planet, everybody on the world, in the world, because of that strength that we project. And there's a reason everybody wants to come here, and we love that, and we want to perpetuate that. But if you water it down to nothing, then we have nothing to offer anyone else, and certainly not our own citizens. So we have an obligation to maintain the law. We have an obligation to do it for all the reasons that Art said, and many more that we could articulate. I think it is a really good question, though, and I think people are losing sight of the 50,000-foot view, and we need to remind them of it, so I appreciate you asking it.
And if I could just follow up on that, and I apologize, Mark, but another point that Congresswoman Jordan made was that if we don't enforce our immigration laws, the American people are going to lose faith in immigration.
Right.
I believe in immigration. I've done immigration for 30 years. If I didn't believe in it, I might as well just get a different job. When the American people see 2 million people entering illegally, and the congressman had alluded to this earlier, we don't know how many gotaways we get. But the best number that I can figure out is about 400,000. That means 2 million people have entered the United States illegally.
This year.
This year. 1 year. And again, remember, most of those people were after January. So you can imagine what 2022 is going to look like. The American people will lose faith in immigration. They will turn against immigration. Mark's points with respect to asylum and getting out of the Refugee Convention are well taken because they make sense. I haven't signed on to the program yet, but, we need to be a country that accepts people in. But the American people, I'm worried, are going to turn against immigration when they see the laws not being enforced. And that itself is a reason to enforce the immigration laws, to ensure that we remain a country of immigrants.
I have another question here that's a good question for the congressman, a political one, but I'll just sort of add to the answer that this is basically the subject of my 2008 book, which is available in the digital remainder bin on Amazon for those who are interested. And my point is that all of the explanations that Art and the congressman gave are all the same thing. They're all part of the same problem, which is mass immigration is incompatible with the characteristics of a modern society and a modern economy. In other words, the immigrants today aren't really any different from the past. We are. In good ways and bad ways, we have a post-industrial knowledge-based economy. We have a welfare state. Transportation and communication advances shrink the world, making assimilation more complicated than they were in the past, making the security challenges greater than they were in the past. All of those are the analogy, the image I use is, the blind men feeling an elephant, and each one thinks the one holding the tail thinks he has a broom. The other bumping up against the foot thinks it's a tree. It's all the same, different parts of the same animal. So I had to get a plug in for my book. There's a question we got, a political question, which sort of relates to what you had talked about, Congressman, but more specifically about the Republican caucus. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to be talking out of school, so decide how much you want to talk about. But you said, for instance, that letter about the Del Rio fiasco, you had 40-something people sign on. That the letter on Remain in Mexico, you had, 89, 90 people sign on. And the Republican Study Committee has this playbook with all kinds of things, immigration as well as other things, sort of to, right out of the block once you have a chance. And the Republican Study Committee is the largest caucus in the Republican, within the Republican caucus, but it doesn't include everybody. And so you're getting the point of where I'm going with this question is, do you have consensus even among Republicans on a lot of these changes? Because there's obviously a lot of Republicans who either for libertarian ideological reasons, business donor concerns or whatever, aren't fully on board a lot of this stuff. So what are your thoughts on that, or how much can you tell us about that?
Well, I'll tell you very forthrightly, you're not supposed to give guarantees in politics or in the law, but I'll guarantee you that when we get ready to move a real reform measure, that we'll have almost every Republican. I mean, RSC has 158 members now. I mean, it's the super majority of the Republican conference. And there's a reason, for example, the letter on Del Rio, Texas had 50 or so. There are lots of letters floating around Capitol Hill every day, and not everyone gets an opportunity to sign on.
So it's not a
released.
sign of
It's not a
disagreement
sign,
necessarily.
no.
Okay.
That discharge position with the 89 members, we're trying to move the Remain in Mexico policy, the act. If we were able to actually get it discharged, you'd get almost every Republican vote. So that's not necessarily a signal of lack of support. It's just logistics. There's a lot going on the Hill. But I do think, as I said, when we get the majority, I believe this will be one of the top priorities. I think the American people are going to demand it. I mean, that's what the polling's saying right now. This is among the top 3 concerns of the American people. The people like us who work on this all the time, are really grateful for that the attention has been paid. Now the duty is ours to provide real responses. And I'm really grateful for the work of the center, because your scholarship on this and your thoughts are important. It informs us on how we're going to solve a lot of this, and that'll be a big part of it.
And, our panel's about asylum, obviously, but in a sense, that's almost one of the easier things, I think, to get consensus about, especially among Republicans, because it's so outrageous. To move sort of beyond that, does, for instance, the RSC playbook, or you personally or whatever, have thoughts on what we're going to do on some of the legal immigration questions? Because that's where you get disagreement sometimes.
Well, my Asylum Reform and Border Protection Act is part of the RSC playbook,
Right.
and it does a number of things. I mean, there's Real quick, some features of that bill, it would bar, on the asylum issue, it would bar the government from paying for counsel for a person in any immigration proceeding. It raises that burden of proof. We've talked a lot about the credible fear analysis and really the abuse of that, but it would make it, instead of being significantly possible, the new standard would be more probable than not. That sounds like legalese and all that, but it has a big impact, as the former judge would tell us, in those proceedings. It would require standardizing and recording of removal proceedings so that there's a little transparency involved here. It would impose restrictions on the use of paroles, that it can only be applied on an individualized basis instead of to large groups. Bar an alien from seeking asylum while in the U.S. if they can be removed to a safe third country where they can seek asylum. Bar several grounds for asylum related to general violence. In other words, you can't say, well, my community and my home country is really unsafe. No, it has to be you personally, your family. And it expands what constitutes a frivolous asylum application to include those filed solely to delay removal and others, many problems we've identified. So these are common sense solutions to the problem that ails us, and there's a lot of good ideas like that on the table that I think will be brought forward when we have the numbers to pass it.
We have one last question.
Thank you. I heard it in, can you hear me?
Yes.
I heard it in Democratic circles many times that 1.65 million apprehensions doesn't mean 1.65 million people, because one person keeps trying to cross the border. What's your take on that one?
The experts can answer it better, but I'll tell you that we don't really know. I think most people recognize, at least on our side, understand, and I think the American people understand, that these figures that we're throwing around are dramatically undercounted. We're not overcounting this, okay? We can see with our own two eyes that we have a crisis. And when we talk about the gotaways and the people who came in undetected, we know there are large numbers of those. I mean, we say probably 2 million. I actually believe, and many people in Texas and people in the border communities believe the number is much higher than that. Because, for example, we have less Border Patrol agents now because many are leaving the service because they're done with this. They're so frustrated. And the agents that are there, they're not patrolling the border as they're supposed to be. Many or most of them now are working as processing agents in these centers. They're like social workers, And so that
Walmart greeters. is
Walmart
one or the
greeters,
other,
right?
exactly, yeah.
To their great frustration and chagrin. And so that border is not protected. When we say it's an open border, this is not a metaphor. It is open. And so if they're coming in at all hours of the night and there's vulnerabilities all along the southern border, we have no idea who's come in, how many there are. We know it's more than 1.6 million. So they can quibble about this. There are some people that actually are apprehended, a handful in relative terms, and are sent back. Well, they come right back through again. Maybe they pay another cartel, whatever. But I think the numbers are undercounted, not overcounted.
Yeah, and if I could, this is one of those arguments that are made by the Biden administration, pushed by CBP, current leadership, and made by individuals who support the disaster that exists at the border. And there are people out there. There are large business interests that want all the free labor they can get. And so they will push this canard. And it is that. The recidivism rate in 2021 was about 27%, which is what you're describing. So somebody gets arrested, they get sent back, and then they re-enter. Counts as 2 encounters, but CBP is like, oh, it was only one unique encounter. Like this is some sort of new system. The recidivism rate in 2021 was about 27%. In August, it was about 26%, so it actually dropped a little bit. That has a lot to do with Title 42. CDC orders we send people back across the border. They attempt to reenter. That's not a big surprise. It's not a big surprise to anybody that's been doing immigration for any period of time. The recidivism rate was actually higher in the past. It was about 29% in 2007 when we got a third or half of the number of people we got this year. It was 31% in 2005. We don't even have numbers before 2005 because nobody cared. Border Patrol agents still have to pick up that person every time they show up, whether it's once or a bunch of times. And, the congressman's point on this is absolutely the key. And this is the part, 37% of Americans support the president's immigration policies. They don't even know how bad it is.
Right.
When I was in Del Rio, Texas in August, actually, let me go back. When I was in Del Rio, Texas 4 years ago, there was a Border Patrol vehicle on every street. There was a Border Patrol agent everywhere you looked, and on that list of important phone numbers, it wasn't the hospital or the police that was at the top, it was Border Patrol, because they provide almost all of the law enforcement at the border. No matter what the law is, they're sort of like the Mounties in Canada. When I was in Del Rio in August, there were no vehicles on the street. The only agents I saw were at the checkpoint north of town and were standing under the bridge that's now famous because that's where 15,000 Haitian migrants had to build their own shelters because the United States government couldn't even provide for them. There were so many. That border is wide open. You can cross back and forth at will. And when I stood down by the river and I was, looking around, there was a young local fellow from the other side of the river who was literally portaging people's clothing across the river for them. And when I looked at him, he stared back at me. He glared at me. How dare I have the impudence to even look at him? It's like staring at somebody on the street in Washington, D.C. There is no border in Del Rio, Texas. There's very little border today in Yuma, Arizona, because agents are overwhelmed. Rio Grande Valley. It just doesn't exist. And this is a huge vulnerability. Drugs are coming in. We're not stopping. Yeah. In June, July, and August of 2021, Border Patrol agents in the Del Rio border, 254 miles of border, 50,000 square miles of area, apprehended 2 pounds of drugs, both marijuana. Somebody, probably the kid who was carrying the stuff across, happened to have a bunch of nickel bags on him. They got popped, and that was the poundage of drugs that they got. This is out of control. This is poisoning. Those drugs will poison American cities, and what we're talking about today, is exactly that. And again, recidivism is high. It's been higher in the past. There's your answer. I mean, there is the answer to all those people who make that point. But the more important issue is whether that person enters once or 48 times. And when I was at the INS, I saw a guy who entered illegally 48 times before we finally got tired and finally prosecuted him. It doesn't matter because the agents still have to apprehend and process, feed, many cases clothe that individual. That's the problem.
And we didn't even mention the fentanyl. 9,000 pounds of fentanyl, enough to kill every man, woman, and child in America. The human trafficking crisis. I mean, there's so many compounding issues that come out of this, and it would take different panels to handle all those issues.
It would indeed, but all of them are, in a sense, enabled by the fact that most of the Border Patrol is on diaper duty instead of actually patrolling the border. And the last observation related to this issue about the border is that I just led a border tour down in El Paso in New Mexico a few weeks ago, and I had stopped at one of the areas where they had stored these wall materials that you referred to. I mean, acres and acres, thousands of these units just piled up. And the wall was there. This was like a distribution point for the materials. And every other time we end up coming near the border and we're looking at the fence and we're wandering around, somebody always shows up in the past. Even on the Canadian side, the Mounties showed up 15 minutes after we started talking to somebody who lived right on the border. This time, nowhere when we were right up there at the fence, sometimes clowning around on the part of the fence that wasn't finished, no one ever showed up. No Border Patrol ever showed up because they were off doing other things. They weren't patrolling the border.
And all those acres of rotting materials were already paid for by the American
people.
Oh,
Absolutely.
It was being wasted.
And it wasn't just even the steel. It was these concrete boxes that they bury underground for the communications equipment, hundreds of those. PVC piping, miles of it. It was just sitting there. So on that optimistic note, I think we'll finish. The Congressman has the people's business to attend to. I thank you, Congressman Mike Johnson, for helping us out and giving us your thoughts. Arthur, his work is all online at CIS.org. All of our work is online at CIS.org, as well as Todd Bensman, whom I am filling in for. And this was his book that we published. No, we didn't publish. He wrote it. It was published by Post Hill Press earlier this year, specifically on border issues, America's covert border war, the untold story of the nation's battle to prevent jihadist infiltration. We will be revisiting this issue, I assume, as the congressman himself will be, and we hope you follow the issue and follow us for future events. Thank you.